The year was 1998, a time defined by the flickering glow of thick-backed monitors. We had recently relocated to a sprawling, newly minted suburban development that sat like a concrete island in the middle of a dense, ancient forest of cedar and pine. Our house was a standard colonial-style build, smelling of fresh paint and synthetic carpeting, appearing entirely too modern to harbor anything resembling a haunting or a dark history. I spent my afternoons tucked away in a cavernous bonus room located directly above the garage, a space filled with translucent storage bins and the hum of a small portable television. Outside, the sky was often a heavy, bruised gray, and the wind would whip through the tall trees, making the brand-new walls of our home groan under the pressure. It was the kind of neighborhood where every driveway looked the same, a perfect picture of suburban safety that felt increasingly like a fragile mask for something far older. I would often sit on the floor in my oversized flannel shirt and baggy jeans, sketching in a spiral notebook while some mindless variety show played in the background to keep the silence at bay. For the first few months, the house felt empty in a peaceful way, but gradually, a heavy sensation of being watched began to settle into the corners of the bonus room. I would be focused on my drawings when a sudden flash of movement would catch my eye, darting across the narrow hallway that led toward the master suite. It was never a clear shape, just a blur of localized darkness that seemed to move with a speed and fluid grace that defied any logical explanation. Whenever I would snap my head around to catch a better look, the hallway would be empty, bathed in the sterile, yellow light of the overhead fixtures. I tried to convince myself that it was just my eyesight adjusting to the dim room, or perhaps a trick of the shadows cast by the swaying trees outside the window. The atmosphere in the house shifted from merely unsettling to actively oppressive during a particularly rainy week, when the damp cold seemed to seep through the double-paned glass. My older brother was usually downstairs in the kitchen or out with friends, leaving me as the sole occupant of the upper floor during those long, drizzly afternoons. One evening, while I was organizing my collection of vintage cassettes, the temperature in the room plummeted so sharply that I could see the faint mist of my own breath. A rhythmic, muffled thudding began to vibrate through the floorboards, sounding less like a settling house and more like a heavy, barefoot gate pacing back and forth in the crawl space. I remember freezing in place, my heart hammering against my ribs, as the sound moved from the edge of the room toward the very spot where I was sitting. The air grew thick with the smell of wet earth and stagnant water, a scent that had no business existing inside a house that was less than 5 years old. Driven by a desperate need for a change of scenery, I retreated to the small bathroom at the end of the hall, hoping that the bright vanity lights would provide some sense of reality. I stood over the sink and splashed my face with cold water, trying to steady my breathing and tell myself that my imagination was simply getting the better of me. As I reached for a hand towel, I caught sight of my own reflection in the wide mirror, but something about the image felt distorted, as if the glass were vibrating. Suddenly, I felt the unmistakable weight of a cold, solid hand, pressing down firmly on my left shoulder, the fingers long and unnaturally thin. In the reflection, a tall figure stood directly behind me, draped in tattered, earth-stained clothing, with a face that remained a featureless, terrifying void of gray shadows. The grip was so physical and so intense that I could feel the individual pressure of the knuckles digging into my skin through the fabric of my heavy flannel shirt. The sheer terror of the contact broke my paralysis, and I let out a choked gasp before spinning around, only to find the bathroom completely and utterly empty. I didn't wait for a second encounter, bolting out of the room and flying down the stairs with a reckless speed that nearly sent me tumbling headfirst into the foyer. I fumbled with the heavy deadbolt of the front door, my hands shaking so violently that it took several attempts to finally wrench the handle open and spill out into the night. The rain was coming down in sheets, soaking me instantly, but the biting cold of the storm was infinitely more welcome than the suffocating presence lurking inside those walls. I stood in the middle of the cul-de-sac, staring up at the dark windows of the bonus room, waiting for a sign of life or a hint of the thing that had touched me. The streetlights flickered with a sickly orange hue, casting long shadows across the empty driveways of a neighborhood that suddenly felt like a graveyard with a fresh coat of paint. When my mother finally arrived home later that evening, I was huddled on the porch, drenched and shivering, refusing to step back inside the threshold of our front door. After I explained the sensation of the hand and the featureless face in the mirror, she didn't dismiss my claims with the usual parental skepticism I had anticipated. Instead, she turned pale and admitted that she had been experiencing her own series of inexplicable events while I was away at school during the day. She described hearing the heavy front door click open and shut, followed by the sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps ascending the stairs toward the bedrooms. On several occasions, she had even called out my brother's name, believing he had come home early, only to find the entire upper floor silent and the rooms completely vacant. We sat in the kitchen that night with every light in the house turned on, the modern architecture suddenly feeling like a glass cage that offered us absolutely no protection from the unseen. Driven by a restless need to understand what was encroaching on our lives, my mother began researching the history of the land long before the suburban developers had arrived. We discovered that while our house was brand new, the ground it sat upon had been a sprawling, isolated farmstead dating back over a century and a half. The records indicated that a small private family cemetery had once existed, just a few hundred yards from where our cul-de-sac now terminated into the woods. Though the headstones had been moved decades ago during a previous land sale, the records of the actual excavations were disturbingly vague and incomplete. It became clear that the developers had likely paved over the original homestead, effectively trapping whatever remained beneath the foundations of our modern, cookie-cutter residences. The realization that we were living on top of an old, neglected site of mourning changed the way we viewed the very air inside our hallways. The activity intensified as the autumn turned into a bitter, early winter, with the house seemingly reacting to our newfound knowledge of its hidden, dark past. I started waking up in the middle of the night to find my bedroom door standing wide open, despite having locked and bolted it before going to sleep. The smell of wet, tilled soil would become so pungent in the hallways that it would wake us from our sleep, lingering in the air like a physical presence. My mother found handprints in the steam on the bathroom mirror that were far too large to belong to anyone in our family, appearing even when no one had used the shower. We began to hear a low, melodic humming coming from the vents, a sound that resembled an old folk tune that none of us recognized or had ever heard before. It felt as though the previous inhabitant was trying to reclaim the space, asserting its dominance over the newcomers who had disturbed its long, silent rest. One afternoon, I decided to venture into the unfinished portion of the basement to see if I could find any physical evidence of the old farmstead's original foundation. The air down there was significantly colder than the rest of the house, smelling of ancient dust and the metallic tang of old, rusted iron tools. As I moved my flashlight across the concrete walls, the beam landed on a small, rectangular patch of dirt that had never been properly covered by the builders. In the center of that dirt patch sat a single, weathered leather boot, its style so archaic that it clearly predated the 20th century by a significant margin. I reached out to move it, but as my fingers brushed the leather, the light in my hand flickered and died, plunging me into a total, suffocating darkness. I felt that same cold, thin hand wrap around my ankle with a crushing force, pulling me toward the unpaved earth with a terrifying, mindless strength. I screamed and kicked wildly, feeling the grip loosen just enough for me to scramble back toward the wooden stairs that led up to the safety of the kitchen. My mother met me at the top of the stairs, her face a mask of terror as she pointed toward the basement door I had just frantically slammed shut. From behind the wood, we heard a slow, deliberate scratching, like fingernails dragging across the grain, accompanied by a heavy thud, as if someone were leaning their entire weight against it. There were no words spoken between us, but the silent agreement was immediate. We could no longer coexist with the history that we had inadvertently moved into. We spent the rest of the night in the car, watching the house from the safety of the driveway, while the motion sensor lights triggered repeatedly for no reason. The house stood silent and imposing under the moonlight, a beautiful facade for the restless, earth-stained spirit that refused to be forgotten or paved over. We moved out within the month, taking a significant financial loss just to escape the oppressive atmosphere that had begun to feel like a living, breathing entity. I often wonder about the families who moved in after us, and whether they ever feel that sudden, sharp drop in temperature while brushing their teeth in the morning. Sometimes I see advertisements for new housing developments being built on old, rural outskirts, and I can't help but think about what might be lying beneath the fresh sod. The modern world likes to pretend it has conquered the past with concrete and steel, but some things are woven too deeply into the soil to be suppressed. The late 1990s had a specific kind of stillness, especially in the high, windswept valleys of the rural West where my family lived. I remember the scratchy texture of my oversized flannel shirts and the heavy hummed static of the old box television in the corner. That winter was particularly brutal, burying our porch in drifts of snow that looked like frozen waves. My loyal companion, a massive black hound with ears like velvet, didn't survive the deepest freeze of January. We found him curled up in the woodshed, his body as cold as the iron tools surrounding him. The silence that followed his passing was a heavy, physical weight that seemed to press against my chest every single day. A week after we buried him beneath the frozen earth, I was sitting alone in the dimly lit living room. The only light came from the orange glow of the wood-burning stove, casting long, dancing shadows across the hardwood. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of heavy claws clicking against the floorboards echoed from the kitchen doorway. My breath hitched as I turned my head, seeing a dark, solid shape standing exactly where he used to wait for his dinner. He looked remarkably real, his fur appearing thick and matted with the melting snow he always brought inside. I stood up slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, but as I stepped toward him, the kitchen became empty. I decided to keep the encounter to myself, convinced that grief was simply playing cruel tricks on my tired mind. However, the atmosphere in our isolated farmhouse began to shift, growing thick with an unspoken, lingering tension. My parents soon began to complain about a persistent rhythmic scratching at their bedroom door in the early hours of the morning. They mentioned how the sound started exactly at 3, a heavy, deliberate scraping that didn't sound like any common house pest. We tried to rationalize it as the old timber settling or perhaps a stray animal seeking warmth. Yet the house felt watched, as if an invisible guardian was still patrolling the hallways with a ghostly purpose. The realization that I wasn't the only one witnessing the impossible happened during a quiet evening on the sofa. We were watching a grainy VHS tape when my parents suddenly bolted upright, their face turning a ghostly shade of pale. They pointed a trembling finger toward the darkened hallway, describing the exact silhouette of the hound I'd seen before. They spoke of the way his eyes caught the light, gleaming with a dull, familiar recognition, before he vanished into the shadows. In that moment, the narrative changed from a private delusion to a shared, terrifying reality that we couldn't ignore. We sat there in the flickering light of the television, acknowledging that our protector had never truly left the property. As the years passed, the sightings became a strange, accepted part of our lives, occurring in brief, silent intervals. We eventually decided to leave that valley behind, hoping to find a fresh start in a warmer, more populated coastal region. We packed our lives into a rusted truck, leaving the cold winds and the memories of the woodshed far behind us. The new house was modern, filled with bright light and the salty scent of the nearby ocean breeze. For the first few months, the silence was finally peaceful, and we began to believe the haunting was tied to the land. We thought the spirit of the hound was finally resting in the mountain soil where we had laid him. That sense of peace was shattered just last week while I was organizing the new garage under the dim glow of a single bulb. I heard the familiar, heavy thumping of a tail against the concrete floor, a sound so specific it made my blood turn to ice. My parent came out a few minutes later, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and genuine, deep-seated fear. They described seeing a flash of dark fur darting behind the water heater, followed by the sound of a low, rumbling huff. It seems that the loyalty of a guardian doesn't end with the physical body or the boundaries of a map. We are waiting now, listening to the walls of this new house, knowing that the scratching will eventually return.